It's always a great pleasure to be here in Stockholm. I want to try and see if I can kind of cut down the length of the presentation. So let me kind of start by saying I won't actually say a great deal about design, except to say really it's the category which for the purposes of this presentation is like the enemy. Of course, I'm not going to be able to get rid of the idea of design. It will continue to haunt us. But really, it's, just to put it very dogmatically, it's the following aspects of the category of design, which in a sense I'm opposing. And in opposing, I'm at least experimenting with the idea of editing as something that we might put in its place, not just where there was design, but where there was a whole series of intellectual activities within architectural discourse. So the characteristics of design that I'm opposing essentially is what you might call its intellectualist idea. The idea that a design, in some sense, is the beginnings of the materialization of something called an idea. If there's one idea which really ruins architectural theory, it's the idea of idea. We do not deal with ideas, even though we have to mobilize ideas in order to oppose them. Ideas themselves come with a kind of terrible charge. People wait to have them. And amongst those who are permanently waiting are architects. Architects have an extraordinary capacity to wait around for an idea. That's why they stay up at night. I mean, what they're doing, of course, as we shall find, is postponing something. But if you're thinking about ideas, you're always waiting for them. In a sense, this whole business of design, of ideas, comes to us in the aftermath of religion. I mean, they're essentially religious ideas in which we imagine that even if we don't have God, we have turned humans into little gods. Or as Freud says at the beginning of the pleasure principle, beyond the pleasure principle, truly man has become a prosthetic god, which is rather different from being a god. So I'm just going to have to leave you initially with the idea that in some sense design is what I'm mobilized to get against. Often the idea of design, or anything across the arts, also brings with it in its train, I think, the most lowering concept in the whole vocabulary of the humanities, which is the category of creativity. I mean, if ever there was a useless concept, it's creativity. I mean, it is the source of more sterile argument, etc., etc. Actually, rather than go through design, in order to concentrate what I'm saying, I'll take the example of, in a sense, an experience with PhD students over rather more decades than I choose to remember. There's something I've always noticed about PhD students: intelligent, hardworking, etc., etc. I mean, sometimes stupid and bone idle, but let's grant intelligent and hardworking. PhD always takes much longer than they think it would, and indeed that it should. And this is always testimony, in some sense, to something that we could regard as a block. Now, this block is that they're waiting, in some sense, for the idea. It might now be called the argument, but it's the idea. They think they've done lots of stuff, like go to the library, sharpen their pencil. For years they've been like preparing, but somehow they invest themselves in still not doing it because they're waiting. I mean, you know, anyone starting a PhD should be compelled to read Waiting for Godot, especially the exchange between the two central characters where one says to the other, do you believe in life after death? To which the other one replies, I was rather hoping for some before. Oh, sorry. Ah. Completely involuntarily using a computer. Now, what the student, and I have to be completely unashamed in my use of psychoanalytic theory, is doing here is manifesting a number of things which form the core of this block. One is inhibition. I can't imagine myself doing a PhD or a design, so you've locked yourself out. You know, you're waiting, but you're outside. Or it's idealization. Often the person who is absolutely prone with the inability to move, let alone think, is because secretly they want an incredibly good PhD, and they fear that the one they could produce at best might be good. And so, as it were, their unconscious has gone on strike. And they want to ask their supervisor, you know, frankly, unless you tell me my PhD will be the work of a genius, I'm not even going to try. Or it's the superego. If they had an idea, they'll be punished. Therefore, I can only escape punishment by not having ideas. And actually, you can see that that really works, because up to now I haven't had any ideas and I haven't been punished yet. So you could, I mean, it really does work. And postponement. What really the student is resisting is the idea, in some sense, that they have always already done the PhD. They think the PhD belongs to the future. The phrase we should really enjoy is that it is done toujours déjà. It's just they haven't noticed it, or they haven't responded. This idea of something always already is beautifully articulated by the famous pediatrician and psychoanalyst Winnicott. He dealt with the problem that many of his patients came saying that they were terrified of that they would soon have a mental breakdown. Winnicott realized after a while that the correct interpretation to give them is, don't worry, it's already happened. And the fear goes. I mean, you're in it. As a consequence, pedagogically, I treat supervision within the PhD as a continuous process of editing. Actually, I think now from the very first meeting, they're already editing. The PhD, in some sense, is done. They've just got to edit it. I think it's vital that, you know, you start the PhD by saying you've already done it. I mean, of course, they've got to go and do some research, but research, quite rightly, is not called search. It's looking it up again. As Freud says, no one can find an object. You can only re-find an object. Now, it's difficult in architecture because the word research is used so promiscuously I don't know if it is here. It certainly is at the AA. I mean, it's called research even if you express mild curiosity about something. It's there already, and as it were, then you don't have to wait, you can just edit. I think this idea of editing is what you might call the secular, the non-religious response to making something. You're not, in a divine way, creating something out of nothing, ex nihilo. You're recreating it. Actually, God, who knows a thing or two, I mean, if you actually look at Genesis, he doesn't create the world. He kind of edits the stuff that's there. You know, there's always stuff there. Then he kind of draws a line between day and night and land and sea. But essentially, it's a kind of the whole thing's a kind of re-edit rather than a creation. In that sense, once you get the student to edit, they're not faced with this central anxiety. It's important in that sense. The thesis will come out, but I mean, when I say thesis, I also mean at this point the design. I mean, I could have said all this about design rather than PhD. You want to get the student to be so distracted by editing that they forget their problem with the object. It occurred to me once that this is actually rather like what's mistakenly understood now as method acting. If you look in Stanislavski, the heart of method acting goes something like this. You're preparing what actors will call your part. What you do is usually think of an animal which might be emblematic of the part that you're playing, and then you concentrate in acting solely on the animal. You let the part just go through you. I was trying to think this morning whether you will have seen an obvious old-fashioned method acting way. Possibly a lot of people in the room saw the movie of The Silence of the Lambs with Anthony Hopkins playing Hannibal Lecter. There's a very old-fashioned method acting because you can see that the whole way through the performance he's thinking about a cat. And you can see occasionally his lips. I mean, the cat was clearly chosen as the emblematic animal for Hannibal Lecter. You don't have to worry about it. Once you've got that, you know, it just happens. The other way of putting this is to say design, like creativity, is in some sense unrepresentable. You can't represent, actually you can't represent the making of something. And I think this is not understood. It's certainly not understood by philosophers, but I think psychoanalysis kind of does. You can't represent, at least you can't represent as an experience, things which are beyond the limits of language. I don't mean beyond in some mystical sense. It's observed, I think, by many people that if we take a literary form like the novel, there are certain things it cannot represent, as it were, from a point of view of internal subjectivity. It really can't represent the following: eating, shitting, fucking, and thinking. Eating, shitting, fucking, and thinking. Sounds like the paper Heidegger never wrote. Oh, good damn it. I was wondering how you're going to sign it. Now, the reason for the unrepresentability isn't some mysterious thing. It's because they clearly all predate the acquisition of language. Some people might want to contest the sexuality bit, but let me assure you, watch very small children and you'll see they're entirely sexual. And that is to say, the second consequence is not just that they're beyond or before language, they're covered by infantile amnesia. So we don't have a mental space like memory in which we can kind of code them as mental representations. If anything, the issues which deal with kind of what we would call creativity are all before language and therefore unrepresentable. If they're coded anywhere, they're coded as a bodily experience. That is to say, we know what we're doing when we do any of those, even if we can't say what we're doing. Of course, any of those things can be described in a novel. You can describe someone eating, you can describe someone shitting, but I really defy anyone to kind of evince an element of a novel which deals with any of those from the interior of their experience. In that sense, they're unconscious. Now, given that, they're not going to come to consciousness. No one's going to say, aha, I've now got 30 seconds and I can think. We don't think like that. What we do is edit something that we reconstruct as having always already been there. Okay, perhaps this kind of has some plausibility if we're talking about pedagogy, but I want, towards the end, just to press it on a little bit further. Because I think this idea of editing has a certain kind of reference, let's say, within architectural history. Because I think architectural history is astonishingly bad at the basic categories which it lays out, around which it organizes its analyses and stories. Seems to me we have an idea which arises most obviously at the beginning of the Renaissance of an addition. It's in a sense the invention of kind of humanist inquiry. Now, it pits itself as trying to recover an original. But what I think is less noticed is that it does that only by constructing or reconstructing a history of error. What's important for the scholar is not to worry too much about the truth. What the scholar editor is concerned with is error. So we could say that in some sense, and it's clear that this idea passes quite strongly to architects in the Quattrocento, is that you're attempting to reconstruct an edition of architecture, all'antica, for which really there's not that much archaeological evidence. I mean, considerably less in the 15th century than there is, as it were, now. Especially when you think that till the 18th century, Greek architecture was pretty much a kind of closed book. Once the Ottomans were there. And this attempt to recreate the edition of all'antica, as it were, allows architects to deploy a sort of notion of errors with which they edit out stuff. Although really they don't know the criteria which would govern, you know, they wouldn't really know the original in an elaborated sense. So obviously it affords architects in the 15th century, paradoxically, an astonishing freedom. Now this idea of editions is a way, I think, in which one could begin to undermine the notion of like periods in architectural history, which are themselves very weird things. I mean, if we take it as originating in something like Burckhardt, it's something like an autonomous style over a certain period. And that itself sets up essentially contradictory ideas of influence on the one hand, which seems to me another terrible concept, and discontinuity on the other. There's no way of handling the two relationships. Editions and also the notion of sort of palimpsest. If we think, after all, it would be ridiculous. I mean, there can't have been the classical tradition until the rise of Rome. No one walked around Greece sort of saying, you know, I like the architecture, but I still think there's something missing, you know, which then gets supplied with the arch and the dome. Ah, that's what, you know, now we've got the full classical. That's good. You can read a lot of history books, and it's almost as if that's the case. Oh, apparently now we're going to have the late perpendiculist. I don't know what that's going to be like. But it's going to happen. Mark my words. So, at the level of periodization, a notion of edition and of editing, it seems to me, is a very reasonable account. That brings me on really to the last point, and then I'll stop. Let's take a kind of famous topos. The moment in Victor Hugo's novel where next to Notre Dame, the king, Louis XI, goes to see the first printing press in France and famously says in the Hugo novel, this, pointing at the press, will kill that, pointing at the cathedral. Now, it's one of those moments that people stop and comment. The burden of the commentary goes something like this. What Hugo is trying to convey, according to the standard commentaries, is that the cathedral was the kind of book of the community, as it were, the embodiment, the manifestation, the text, the imagery of the culture. And these values, ideas, whatever, are now going to pass into the printing press. The major medium of the conflict of ideas will now become the printed text. I'm not entirely saying that that's simply wrong, but it seems to me there's a much more obvious and useful suggestion. that this will kill this, let us restrict it entirely to architecture. I mean, as we're beginning to find out, in a sense, what you might call the rise of the classical tradition after the introduction of printing, let's say, beginning of the 16th century, is not by people going to the churches or whatever, looking at them saying, that's a good idea, and taking them home to somewhere like Krakow. It's the effect of the dissemination through the introduction of print, here not meaning a text. The problem is that the whole history of printing is overly dominated by the text. It's through the dissemination of engravings. I mean, in that sense, the 16th century invents, because it publishes, the fundamental disseminated form of what we might call the edition of the classical tradition. I mean, this seems to me to grow perfectly naturally out of the research of someone like Mario Capo. So I'm trying to argue that at the level of pedagogy, where someone wants to create something, whether it's an argument or a design, the idea of editing is very useful. And actually, it's intellectually interesting in terms of being applied not just to design, but to the history of architecture, which is still bizarrely formulated around issues like period and style. In a way, if there's a conclusion, we think we're used architecturally to living in a kind of epoch of the computer. But I think it's very noticeable that many of the terms which we use are from an entirely pre-kind of computing era. It's not that I think we ought to simply collapse all terms into some computational language, far from it. It is, however, that obviously the computer has opened up an idea of editing which actually forces us to transform our idea not only of what it is to make something and to design something, but will completely transform our notion of the past. Thank you.